The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the September installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series. My name is Lauren Caffarel, and I will be your moderator for the webinar today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I wanted to share. First, we will be providing a copy of the presentation via email within 24 hours of the webinar ending. Please be sure to check the email you used to register for the webinar. Also, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So please submit any questions you have at any time using the GoToWebinar questions box on the right side of your screen. Today's presentation is titled Optimizing Your Research Program, Best Practice Approaches to Structure and Staffing, and will be presented by Dr. Rhonda Paz of GuideStar Clinical Trials Management. Dr. Paz has more than 25 years of leadership experience in clinical research. Prior to joining GuideStar, she was the Associate Director for Scientific Administration of the Louisiana Cancer Center Research Consortium, where she was responsible for establishing a centralized administration to oversee and manage scientific programs, internal grant programs, research informatics, as well as research facilities. Prior to that, she was the Director of Clinical Research for 2 prestigious medical centers, overseeing the implementation and operations of the clinical research programs. Her experience makes her uniquely adept at program development, startup, and re-engineering of research operations. Dr. Paz holds a PhD in Health Administration as well as a Bachelor's in Business Administration and Management. She has earned a designation of Certified Contract Research Professional and is active in several industry organizations. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rhonda.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for joining this webinar. Today I'm going to be talking about how to optimize your research program with approaches to structure and staffing.
Muted.
We will look at the critical components of structure and the overarching goals of a staffing structure. As well, I will talk about the various organizational types and what structure makes the most sense to use for each. I don't think my controls are working. Do you have it turned? There we go. Maybe they're just a little slow. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of structuring and staffing a clinical research program, I want to back up a bit and talk a little bit about why do research at all? What is the impact of research on an organization? We have created a graphic that we call the halo effect. It is a visual aid particularly helpful with executive leadership to demonstrate all of the benefits research brings to an organization beyond direct research dollars. There is obviously financial value with providing a revenue stream, attracting new patients, and increasing ancillary service volumes. However, there are indirect benefits such as enhancing an organization's image, increasing market share, and improved community health. Let's review the foundational components of a research structure. There are key organizational components needed for a research program: leadership support, patient specialty mix and volume, and physician interest and participation. On the structural side, key components needed are a solid pipeline of trials, aggressive budget negotiations and subsequent financial management, operational compliance, and research informatics to handle the various administrative duties required to open and track a research study. As you are looking at forming your structure, keep the goals of structure forefront in your mind. Think about how the operation will be governed. It's just running a little slow here, sorry guys. Should you consider a scientific or research advisory board to oversee policy, development, and compliance, monitor performance, and to keep physicians engaged? You also want to make sure you're incorporating a succession plan into that structure. By structuring in management tiers, it sets up your organization for staff turnover, such that staff in the lower management positions can jump up into the higher level management position as soon as they become vacant. The director position is a key position that will focus on business development and act as a key influencer in the operation. This position should have the ability to command key areas that directly impact the success of the research program. For example, departments such as IT, finance, and HR will have a direct impact on research operations. You have to have proper IT support, finance, and patient accounting involvement, and HR so that adequate job descriptions and salary ranges are in place. Depending on the type of organization, it may be beneficial to consider a dyad structure whereby there is a medical scientific leader partnered with an executive business leader. The medical scientific leader focuses on encouraging and motivating physicians and the scientific development, while the executive administrator focuses on the business management and ancillary service buy-in and participation. Selecting and empowering staff expert in the various disciplines in research is also very important in establishing an effective structure. For example, having a research finance manager experienced in pre- and post-award management, a regulatory manager expert in IRB and regulatory processing, and a clinical manager capable of managing study coordination and data management staff. By focusing units by function goes a long way in maintaining efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance. And finally, have well-documented policy and SOPs. That's going to ensure that best practices are being followed, and it will keep the structure cost-effective. Let's delve a little deeper into the staff, the types of staff that you're going to want to employ to build your structure. A focus on administrative staff and clinical staff here is key. Administrative staff types are a director or manager of the clinical trials unit, which oversee the operation and the physical management of the unit. This position can work on business development, strategy, and day-to-day guidance for the management tier in the structure. A regulatory processor focused on IRB submissions and regulatory document preparation is important to maintain overall compliance and complete documentation. For example, regulatory binders. Financial talent is most important to ensure top dollar is negotiated with sponsors and that the funds are collected and dispersed in a compliant manner. It is highly recommended to split research finance into two separate functions: pre-award, which consists of the budget development and contract negotiations, and post-award focusing on invoicing, collections, disbursements, and overall financial reporting of profit and loss at the trial level and the overall program level to ensure that your program remains financially viable. And finally, the clinical personnel. Got a little bit of a delay here. There we go. So your clinical personnel, your patient recruiters, your study coordinators, research nurses, data managers, and research assistants. These are the positions focused on the patient. They screen, enroll, and follow the patient throughout the trial, all while collecting and reporting on the data. The clinical group's main goal is to get patients on trial, thereby increasing the revenue earned for conducting the clinical trials. A trial procurement specialist should be considered, as they can locate and match trial opportunities to physicians and cultivate positive sponsor relations. These efforts will significantly aid in keeping the trial pipeline flowing with lucrative trials. I want to review organizational and structure types, as once you define where on the spectrum that your organization falls, you can then select the appropriate organizational diagram and begin building the structure that will best support your organizational type. For purposes of this webinar, we will focus on the organizational types of academic medical centers, hospital systems, community hospital, large physician practices, which are similar in structure to community hospitals, and finally, independent physician practices. Once you have determined the organizational type, then you need to look at what structure type will best fit your organizational structure. Will your culture embrace a centralized operation, or will departments already operating in a decentralized model feel a lack of control if they are forced into a centralized model? All the while, as you consider this important decision, you must take compliance into consideration. If your decentralized units are not operating optimally and are experiencing compliance issues, you are putting your organization at risk. So this is a key decision-making criteria. And finally, there is a hybrid model where some tasks and services can be centralized, typically those that drive finances and compliance, and some are decentralized, the more clinical aspects, such as deciding what trials to activate at your site and the hands-on patient interaction. As you go through the steps of selecting your ideal structure and implementing it, keep in mind that organizations are constantly evolving. So you want your structure to be flexible and nimble so that it can change with the changing needs of your organization rapidly. Each structure that I'm going to present to you provides a solid foundation upon which to build. But do know that each structure will require customization based on organizational needs and limitations. As I go through each of the structural scenarios, pick the one that best suits your organizational type and culture. Then move the blocks around and experiment. Be creative, but be sure that the structure takes a logical approach and that the staff is placed in a logical formation, keeping in mind the succession planning that is most important to build into the structure. You want to set your organization up for long-term success. Do your best to organize by function and not by individuals. If your structure is based on individuals, when that individual moves on, for whatever reason, your structure will be more difficult to modify. Organizing by function creates depth in staffing, whereby you don't have all of your talent eggs in one basket. I want to touch upon some structure mistakes to avoid. Having worked with many organizations of varying types and structures, I can share some of the pitfalls that we've seen and have corrected out there. For example, it may seem to make sense to house all research activities under one department leadership. However, it is important to keep your governance side of the house, in particular your IRB and compliance, separate from your day-to-day operations for conducting the trial. So having IRBs or research compliance reporting up to your clinical trials office leadership is not recommended. Another big one we've seen quite a bit is having all staff reporting to a single leader. We have seen upwards of 50 employees reporting to a single director. Once you have a critical mass of staff, it is important to separate them out by function with managers or team leaders of each area. This division of labor not only keeps the workload manageable, but also builds in appropriate levels of checks and balances. And the biggest blooper of all time, and I know you're all going to be able to relate to this, thinking a study coordinator can do it all. It's unrealistic to think that one person has the time in a day, or even the skill set for that matter, to develop and negotiate budgets, manage the funds, process and maintain the plethora of regulatory documents, as well as scrub schedules, attend various clinics to screen and enroll patients, and track those patients through the protocol and report on the inordinate amounts of data. And let's not forget managing the various sponsor site visits. I'm exhausted just thinking about all that. Especially in larger operations, keeping your staff divided into functional units of regulatory, research, finance, and study coordination will position your organization for increased revenue generation as well as pristine compliance. If there is one takeaway from this webinar, let that one be it. Let's talk more about the structure types, starting with the decentralized model. In this model, each research unit, such as oncology, cardiology, family medicine, and so on, they function independently under their own SOPs. This requires duplication of positions across the units, especially in the administrative roles. Full decentralization also poses an increased risk to the organization as there is a lack of consistency and standardization, and there's little to no oversight at the leadership level. The hub and spoke diagram depicts a centralized and hybrid infrastructure. This tends to be a good approach in that the administrative duties are housed centrally in an Office of Research Administration, the ORA, while the clinical duties are decentralized out in the clinics, yet still receive guidance and direction from the central office. Organizing in this fashion increases compliance, oversight, and accountability. It also achieves economies of scale, as there is no need to duplicate the administrative FTEs. Let's face it, finding experienced research talent is not easy. It is a flexible model in that specialties can opt in and out without having to change the structure. And finally, in this model, the coordinators in the clinical areas can focus on enrollment, which will positively impact your bottom line because enrollment drives the revenue. This diagram applies to both centralized, whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. This diagram applies to both centralized and the hybrid model. In the centralized version of this model, the administrative staff in the ORA and the staff placed out in the clinics are paid and report centrally. In the hybrid model, the ORA staff report and are funded centrally, while the clinic staff have an administrative report to the central leadership, though functionally report to the specialty leadership and are typically funded by the specialty or department level. Let's look at a sample of an AMC structure. These structures typically do exercise a hybrid model, but also bring into play other areas that a non-AMC do not experience. There is typically a research advisory board to which an executive level manager reports, such as a VP. This VP has the overall responsibility of research operations, IRB support staff, medical education program, all in the realm of their responsibility. There is a director level over research administration, and then it is further broken down at the staff level with a manager of research finance and a manager of the clinical research unit. Under the research finance manager, you may see a breakdown of pre-award and post-award activities, and under the clinical unit manager, you will likely see research units organized by specialty. The clinical units usually have a team leader, and under them fall the study coordinators, data managers, and regulatory staff to process IRB documents and sponsor regulatory documents. AMCs typically have legal counsel centralized and require the use of an internal IRB. A hospital system structure is a bit more consolidated in that they don't typically have an IRB or medical education program, though they can. And if that's the case, then the AMC organization structure may be better suited to them. However, if the hospital system is functioning in a non-academic manner, they typically apply a dyad reporting structure. What this means is that an executive partnership is assigned to run the research program. While you still have a research advisory board governing the overall research program, there is a medical and administrative partnership formed, whereby the structure is governed both from a business standpoint as well as a medical and scientific standpoint. A director reports up to this dyad structure, and under them falls the three facets of the trial administration: study coordination and data management, your clinical arm, and your research finance and regulatory processing, your administrative arms. Hospital systems may have an internal IRB or allow external IRBs, or in many cases allow the use of both based on documented criteria. For example, industry-sponsored trials may go out to an external IRB. However, all other trials, especially investigator-initiated, are required to go through the internal IRB. A community hospital is a bit less complex excuse me, they typically have a clinical trials office manager or director reporting to a chief medical officer or a chief nursing officer. Though like a hospital system, they have 3 functional units of regulatory, research finance, and study coordination and data management. They likely use external IRBs, but certainly can have an internal IRB. Many that do have internal IRBs exercise the hybrid model whereby they can use an external IRB if they choose. The study coordinators typically report centrally. However, there are cases where the study coordinators are located within the specialty department they serve. The large physician practice model is very similar to the structure of the community hospital research operation. However, they usually solely rely on external IRBs, and instead of having an executive report to a CMO or a CNO, the research office reports to the practice administrator and or the lead physician conducting the research. While they have study coordinators dedicated to research activities, the business management aspects of the trial unit is usually supported and supervised by the practice business personnel who may or may not have any trial experience. In this scenario, educating that personnel on research finance is paramount to its success. As we all know, hospital or practice financial management is much different from research financial management. The independent physician practice is the least complex model of them all. While they will have a study coordinator dedicated to the research tasks such as regulatory processing and case report form completion, they usually will have key involvement from the practice, clinical, and business staff. The coordinator, in essence, augments this staff and provides the processes and education to the practice staff. So now that you have your structure and organizational type all figured out with the staff placed accordingly based on your organizational culture, you are ready to support a robust, compliant research effort. But you need to publicize and keep your department visible. You truly need to market your services and constantly remind physicians you are there to support them. Some of the ways to publicize and stay visible include offering the physicians new and innovative studies they may be interested in. Keep them motivated. Market internally and externally relative to your services, how to access your services, and the studies that you have available. If using a website, ensure A-line navigation on the web page. Don't let this valuable service get buried under other topics. Make it front and center, much like a service line. You can develop and distribute newsletters, press releases, and even host annual research retreats to bring together all of the research parties to network and build excitement and momentum. And of course, you will want to remain in the forefront of your leadership's mind as being a successful part of the overall operation regardless of the organization type. A way to do this is to get 15 minutes on the agenda of key committees and boards and tout your performance metrics, such as patient enrollment, profit loss, ancillary service downstream revenue. The bottom line here is make sure your leadership knows the value that you're adding to that organization. And when your program is fully operational, it will be of utmost importance to monitor staffing workloads. You'll need to track when you are at capacity, as you either need to hold steady and not bring on more trials, or you need to hire to maintain and take on more business to continue growing your research program. The best way to do this is to establish workload measurements that equate one FTE to particular tasks. For example, one study coordinator in your organization may be able to manage 20 patients at a time, or a regulatory processor may be able to handle 50 trials at a time, and so forth. But come to an agreement with your leadership on reaching those quotas to drive your staff planning. If you're able to demonstrate the positive revenue to the organization in relation to meeting these workload thresholds, you should be able to come up with a formula that your leadership will buy into and therefore grant you approval for new staff when it's needed. There are a host of staffing workload approaches out there. There's OPAL and the CCIRC algorithm that was created by the NIH years ago. And I bet there are others out there that you're familiar with that you may be using very effectively. And if so, I would love to hear from you on how you approach this industry challenge. We believe in a customized approach, as every organization has unique needs. We also believe that there is a significant need for the development of a versatile industry tool that can be adapted to a variety of organizations for tracking workload and staff planning. But this topic is one that warrants its own webinar, so stay tuned, as this is certainly a topic we will be delving into much greater detail over the next year or so. Well, this concludes my presentation, and I do wish to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I hope the information that we shared helps you optimize your research program efforts.
Unmuted.
Thanks, Rhonda, for that excellent presentation. Now, we will move into the question and answer portion of the presentation. For our first question, I do not see any research compliance for an IRB on any of these diagrams. Where do they fit into this?
So while IRBs and research compliance offices, they're very important to the overall research, but these organizational structures, this particular webinar focused on the organizational structures that are focused on the operational arm of research, and technically the governance arms, such as a research IRB or research compliance office, they should remain separate under a different reporting structure. Because it could actually be considered a conflict of interest. It's sort of in line with the old fox guarding the hen house scenario.
All right. If possible, please share more about tools and resources around research staffing and allocation.
Yes, so that goes back to the workload algorithms. Like I said, there are some tools that are available out there. OPAL, which is very cancer focused, and I think out of Canada, if I recall correctly, but it's still applicable here in the States. And then also, years ago, the NIH developed what they call the CCIRC algorithm, which equates a data management type of work unit to dollars in funding. And so that's certainly something that could be looked at. But what I have really found out there is that each organization is very unique, and so you may have different tasks from one another that take you a little bit longer here or there. So what we've really found is that you may have to do a time study, figure out what those tasks are, and then really come up with some type of a customized algorithm for your organization so that you can determine within your organization how many regulatory documents can one regulatory person manage at any given time, how many patients in active treatment, follow-up treatment, or long-term survival can your coordinator handle, how many accounts could a research finance person reasonably manage. So you have to take a look at that, develop a workload algorithm for each of the unique positions, so then you know what their thresholds are, and you know how to staff. You either, again, have to hold some work at bay if you can't get additional staff in your organization, or you need to demonstrate to your leadership that you have the funding that can equate to that work, so that then they'll grant you the permissions to bring those staff in.
All right. Do research sites use many contract employees that CROs and sponsors use? If yes, what positions are best suited for contractors?
So I do think that outsourcing and contract employees are becoming much more mainstream than they used to be in the old days. But I can say that because I've been doing this for 30 years. So in the old days, it really was you staff. But I think that we're seeing that it's becoming a bit more economical to outsource or contract for some of these other services. Clinical services typically are the ones that really must be internal, because you've got all your credentialing issues, you've got access to PHI, and all of those things that are real sensitive. But your business aspects are things that are much easier to contract out or outsourced out because they can be they're really much more back office type of situations. So I think that as we watch the trends and the industry changing, you'll see a shift more in that realm where clinical are home-based and house-based at the organization, whereas some of those administrative duties can be outsourced and contracted out.
All right. How do I explain how research should be operated when I report to someone who only knows how to run patient care departments?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. You know, research is so specialized, and it is a challenge to get leadership or folks outside of the research realm to really understand the specifics of research and the unique aspects to research. I think if you go back to that halo effect diagram, which was the very first diagram that I showed you, I think that really does help organizations see. I know that in our experience, we've seen lots of light bulbs going off when we see when we're explaining that halo effect. And so I think demonstrating the benefits beyond the direct financial benefits of a research program, being able to clearly demonstrate and show some of those indirect benefits really does help clinical and overall leadership understand research a bit better and the positive impact it can make.
All right, next question is, how cost-effective are organizations who have split out the RC/RN responsibilities with data management staff?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Sure. How cost-effective are organizations who have split out the RC or RN responsibilities with data management staff?
Oh, that's a really good question, and one that I firmly believe in. So, you know, you want to have your research nurses who are, you know, let's face it, they're the more expensive FTE. And they have a much greater, the reason why they're more expensive is because they have a larger skill level, they're licensed, and all of those things. So take a look at where you best use that resource. You know, those resources are best used clinically, hands-on, with the patient in the therapeutic area, you know, maybe phase 1 types of trials. So kind of have them there. And then you bring in non-nurse types of study coordinators to do more of that hands-on protocol work, maybe the screening and the consenting and making sure that the patient is getting all of the medical interventions that are required on each of the intervals through the study. So if you kind of can piecemeal it out that way, you'll get a lot more bang for your buck. The other piece, the data management or research assistant, you know, have those folks focus on the data management as well, or even screening for patients. So if you take the skills and you carve them out into an appropriate leveling, what that does is it allows each staff unit, each staff grouping rather, to focus on something that they can specialize in. Your enrollment will increase, and you're using the appropriate staff level for the appropriate duties.
All right, next question. Where do clinical project managers best fit into the structure?
So clinical project managers, I'm going to think that what we're talking about there is someone more administrative, maybe somebody who is making sure the studies are coming in and getting through the activation process in a timely manner. Hopefully I'm defining that correctly in the context of this question. If not, just touch base with me outside of this and give me more detail and I can answer it better. But those fall in the administrative arm. Those are typically in your intake area. It could be your research director or manager, because they do know how to manage a project and they're responsible for that activation timeline. They're also responsible for keeping a project on budget. So that's always a good place to put it. But depending on the scope and breadth of your regulatory person's abilities, that could also be a place that could go, because they're a group that's touching it all the way through the activation process. So they really belong in the administrative world as opposed to the clinical world, because it really, I look at it as more of a truly a project management skill set.
Next question is, what are the pros and cons of using site management organizations who can negotiate contracts and supply research staff for CRC work?
Well, you know, for the negotiating of the budgets and the contracts, we'll take that portion first. I think that some of the benefits of using an SMO type is, or anyone that's providing those types of services, is that is what they're skilled and trained in. And while your staff may be spread so thin that to negotiate and take the time that it really needs to develop a budget and negotiate that budget when they could otherwise be screening and enrolling patients and increasing your revenue that way, you know, if you do have site management organizations that are doing this for you, they come with the skill set. That's what they focus on. You know, so that's some of the pros. Some of the cons are, you know, they're not right there on site with you. It may be a challenge to build a rapport as quickly as you would if someone was sitting right next to you. But if done appropriately, you can absolutely build those relationships. Clinical, so kind of going over to the second part of that question, which was more of a clinical outsourcing, I think that's also a good approach if you need staff or a staffing pool or somebody to kind of backfill. But the challenges that come in there are, again, I'm going to go back to credentialing and what barriers will you hit in your organization to allow a contract employee to come in and access your patient records and all of that. Now, sites that are effectively using, hospitals that are effectively using agency nursing, well, if they can mirror that somehow, that will be helpful, but you better be careful not to get caught up in medical personnel credentialing versus research personnel credentialing, because it's very different. So if that's a route you want to take, just make sure that you're making sure that it's very differentiated in terms of it's not in medical staff services per se with licensed professionals unless they're research nurses, but focused more in the realm of contract employees, and it's more of an HR process.
All right, and for our last question, why are the structures for a hospital system and a community hospital so different?
Well, it boils down to size. So a community hospital is standalone, and so they're not responsible for multiple research operations out there under their system. So it's a standalone. It's one research operation. It's very consolidated. When you get into a hospital system, you can have upwards of 80 hospitals that are running research, and so you've got to make sure you've got a central operation overseeing compliance and some of the financial pieces, yet allow each of those independent sites that are associated with that hospital to be able to have their own standard operating procedures within which they function, because each of those hospitals are going to be unique entities and have unique needs because they're going to be dispersed geographically as well. So it comes down to sheer size and the whole setup of the business makeup, you know, each its own business entity type of a situation. So I think that it's, you know, scope, size, breadth, and just the sheer nature of being a system versus a standalone community hospital.
All right, so that wraps up our Q&A for today. Just a reminder that the slides will be sent out via email within 24 hours after today's presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending the presentation today. We hope that you have found
Thank you all so much.
We hope that you have found it interesting and informative, and a big thanks again to Rhonda for presenting. Be sure to be on the lookout for the next installment of the Clinical Conductor webinar series.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.